The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a bright glow across the aisles of Anderson's grocery. Sarah leaned over the register, her fingers deftly scanning items as she engaged in light-hearted banter with Mrs. Jenkins, a regular customer. The elderly woman, with her white curls and sparkly blue glasses, had a knack for making even the most mundane shopping trip feel like a delightful outing. "Oh, Sarah, did you hear about the community fair next weekend?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, her voice a mixture of excitement and nostalgia. "I can hardly wait. It's been ages since we've had anything like it around here. I'm bringing my famous apple pie. You must stop by my booth." Sarah chuckled, her hazel eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Of course, Mrs. Jenkins. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Your pies are legendary. I'm sure they'll be the talk of the fair." Mrs. Jenkins leaned closer, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I might even throw in a secret ingredient this year. Just between you and me, it's a dash of cinnamon. It makes all the difference." As they shared a laugh, Sarah felt a warmth spread through her. The grocery store was more than just a job. It was a community hub where friendships blossomed over fresh produce and shared stories. But as she glanced toward the back of the store, her heart sank momentarily at the sight of Mr. Anderson, her boss. He was tall and imposing, with a stern expression that rarely softened. Today, his brow was furrowed, and Sarah sensed he was in one of his moods. "Just give me a moment, Mrs. Jenkins," she said, giving the older woman a gentle smile before turning her attention to the line forming at the register. As she finished ringing up Mrs. Jenkins's groceries, the little bell above the door jingled, and in walked Mr. Thompson, a frail man in his late 70s, his silver hair slightly tousled. He shuffled in, struggling to manage 3 heavy bags that seemed to weigh him down more than they should. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson," Sarah called out cheerfully. "Let me help you with those." Before she could think twice, she was already moving toward him, her heart swelling with compassion. Mr. Thompson looked up, his face lighting up with gratitude. "Oh, thank you, dear. These bags seem to grow heavier every week," he replied, chuckling softly as he tried to shift the weight onto one hip. As Sarah reached for the bags, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Anderson watching from the corner of her eye. His expression was dark, a mixture of displeasure and disbelief. But Sarah couldn't shake off her urge to help. She took 2 of the bags from Mr. Thompson and smiled reassuringly. "It's no trouble at all. Let's get you checked out." "Such a kind girl you are," Mr. Thompson said, his voice warm and appreciative. "I remember when my late wife used to help me with the shopping. She had a heart just like yours." Sarah felt a pang of empathy at the mention of his wife. "I'm sure she was wonderful," she said gently, guiding him toward the checkout lane. As they walked, she glanced back to see Mr. Anderson striding toward her, his demeanor sharp and accusatory. She set Mr. Thompson's bags down on the counter and began scanning the items. "How's your day been, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, hoping to keep the mood light. Just the usual. I'm trying to stock up for the fair. The neighborhood needs a good celebration after everything we've been through," he replied, his eyes twinkling with the spirit of community. Before she could respond, Mr. Anderson was upon them, his voice cutting through the atmosphere like a knife. "Sarah," he barked, his tone laced with irritation. "What do you think you're doing? You're supposed to be attending to the customers in line, not playing the Good Samaritan." Sarah's heart raced as she turned to face him, the warmth of her earlier interaction with Mr. Thompson dissipating under the weight of her boss's glare. "I was just helping Mr. Thompson with his bags, sir," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Mr. Anderson's eyes narrowed, his frustration evident. "Helping? You're neglecting your duties. This is a grocery store, not a charity. Get back to ringing up customers or I'll have to take this up with you." "Mr. Anderson, Sarah began, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Enough. You need to focus on your job. If you can't do that, I may have to reconsider your position here," he warned, his tone brooking no argument. Feeling a mix of anger and humiliation, Sarah glanced at Mr. Thompson, who looked on with concern etched across his face. "I am sorry, sir. I'll get back to work," she murmured, her heart sinking. As Mr. Anderson turned on his heel and marched back to the office, Sarah felt the air grow heavy around her. "Don't let him get to you, dear," Mr. Thompson said softly, his voice a balm against her rising frustration. "You're doing a good thing. Kindness is never wasted, even if some people don't see it." Sarah managed a weak smile, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. It just feels like I can't do anything right sometimes." With a few more quick taps on the register, she finished ringing up his groceries and placed them in a bag. "Here you go. That'll be $32.50. As Mr. Thompson fished out his wallet, Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. She had always prided herself on being helpful and kind, yet here she was, being reprimanded for it. "I hope to see you at the fair," she said, trying to inject some happiness back into the conversation. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Sarah. You've got to promise me that you'll stop by my booth," he replied, his face lighting up with warmth. "Absolutely. I'll be there," she assured him. But as he turned to leave, the shadow of Mr. Anderson loomed in her mind, casting doubt over her intentions. As the day wore on, Sarah's thoughts were a tumultuous mix of guilt and defiance. She continued to serve customers, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until her shift ended, wishing desperately for a chance to speak her mind to Mr. Anderson. But the moments she stole to help customers felt increasingly fraught with tension. Every time she saw someone struggling, she hesitated, remembering Mr. Anderson's scathing words. The grocery store, a place that had once felt like a second home, now felt like a cage. Finally, as the afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the aisles, Sarah sighed heavily. She had made it through the day, but it had come at a cost. The kindness she had always embraced was now weighed down by the threat of losing her job, a reality she couldn't bear to think about. As she finished her last transaction, she caught sight of Mr. Thompson leaving the store, a small smile on his face. He waved at her, and for a moment the tension lifted. Maybe kindness did matter, even in the face of adversity. But as she watched him disappear into the parking lot, Sarah felt a sense of foreboding settle back in. She knew that the rift between her values and her boss's expectations was only growing wider, and she was left to wonder how long she could continue to stand on the side of kindness before it cost her everything. As the fluorescent lights flickered above the grocery aisles, Sarah's heart raced not from the thrill of her job, but from the weight of her recent confrontation with Mr. Anderson. Standing at the register, she glanced furtively toward the entrance where Mr. Thompson had just exited, his frail frame hunched under the strain of the heavy bags. Despite the reprimand she had received, a part of her felt proud for having helped him, even if it had come at a cost. "Why do you care so much?" she mumbled to herself, the words barely escaping her lips. The thought echoed in her mind, battling against the guilt that gnawed at her. Yet the memories of Mr. Thompson's gratitude were fresh in her mind. He had looked at her with eyes that sparkled with a warmth she hadn't expected. "Thank you, Sarah," he had said, his voice trembling slightly with age. "You remind me of my late wife. She had a heart as big as yours." That moment replayed in her mind as she continued to scan items for impatient customers. The sound of the register dinging felt more like a tolling bell, marking the decline of her own spirit. The store felt different now, a cage rather than a community hub. Just as she finished with a customer, who huffed away after her brief interaction, Mr. Anderson stormed back into view. The sharp angles of his suit made him look more like a predator than a manager. Sarah squared her shoulders, determined to stand her ground. "What are you doing, Sarah?" he barked as he approached her, his face a mask of irritation. "You're wasting time with these pity projects instead of focusing on your actual job." "I was just helping him," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "He can barely carry his groceries. What's wrong with lending a hand?" Mr. Anderson shook his head, his expression hardening. "You think this is a charity organization? You're here to work, not to play the Good Samaritan. If you can't follow store policy, then perhaps you shouldn't be here at all." The threat hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Sarah swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I understand, Mr. Anderson, but I can't just ignore someone in need. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" He leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "You'll learn the hard way if you keep this up. I won't hesitate to fire you." Torn between her moral compass and the fear of losing her job, Sarah could feel the walls closing in around her. She nodded reluctantly, feeling the soft touch of betrayal creeping into her heart. "I'll comply," she said, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. "Good. Now get back to work," he snapped before turning away, leaving Sarah feeling smaller than ever. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity as she scanned items and counted change. Her mind wandered back to Mr. Thompson, the way his eyes had crinkled with joy when she offered to help him. It didn't feel like a disruption. It felt like a connection. As her shift finally came to an end, Sarah gathered her things, her heart heavy with uncertainty. She walked toward the back of the store, the echo of her footsteps underscored by the hum of the fluorescent lights. Just as she reached the door to the break room, Mr. Anderson called out to her, "Sarah, my office. Now." Her stomach twisted into knots as she approached the door of his office. The space was sterile and devoid of warmth. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating an eerie atmosphere. Mr. Anderson sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled as he looked up at her with cold eyes. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair across from him. She complied, her heart racing as she braced herself for whatever was about to come. "Do you understand the importance of following store policy?" he began, his tone clipped. "You've been warned twice now about your behavior, and I can't have employees disrupting the workflow because they think they know better. I was just trying to help Mr. Thompson." "Enough," he barked, cutting her off. "Your job is to ring up customers, not to play nursemaid. I can't have this kind of distraction. It's not just poor management. It sets a precedent for the rest of the staff." Sarah felt a lump rising in her throat, her heart sinking as she realized where this was heading. "Please, Mr. Anderson, I promise I'll do better. I didn't mean to overstep." He sighed, his expression hardening further. "I've made my decision. You're terminated, effective immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You can't be serious," she whispered, disbelief flooding her system. "I've worked here for years. Your tenure means nothing if you can't follow the rules. I suggest you gather your things and leave," he said coldly, his gaze unyielding. With her world collapsing around her, Sarah stood up, fighting back tears as she walked out of the office. Each step felt like a betrayal not just to herself, but to Mr. Thompson, to the very kindness she believed in. As she reached the exit, she couldn't help but look back one last time at the only place she had ever really known. "Goodbye, Sarah," Mr. Anderson called after her, his voice dripping with indifference. Outside, the cool breeze hit her face, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the store. She took a deep breath, trying to ground herself. The weight of her termination felt like a leaden anchor pulling her down. As she walked away, her mind raced with thoughts of what she would do next. The small town felt vast and empty, filled with possibilities yet stifled by the weight of her recent loss. She wanted to scream, to unleash her frustration upon the world. But instead, she felt a quiet resolve begin to form within her. "Maybe it's time for a change," she whispered to herself, clenching her fists. "Maybe I can find something better." But as she walked, her heart ached with the sting of betrayal. She had believed in the goodness of people, in the power of kindness, and now it all felt like a distant memory. The grocery store had been her second home, and now she was being cast out like a stray dog. "Just wait until I find something new," she murmured, her voice laced with determination. "I'll show them." Little did she know that fate had other plans in store, waiting just around the corner, ready to transform her moment of despair into a stepping stone toward a brighter future. Sarah sat on the cold bench outside the grocery store, her heart heavy with the weight of her recent dismissal. The sun was beginning to set behind the small town buildings, casting long shadows on the pavement. It was a typical afternoon, yet for Sarah, everything felt different. She could still hear the echoes of Mr. Anderson's harsh words in her mind, replaying the moment he handed her the termination notice like a cruel joke that had been played on her. As she stared absently at the ground, her thoughts swirled around in a mix of anger, confusion, and deep disappointment. How could Mr. Anderson fire her for helping someone in need? The idea seemed ludicrous, yet it had happened. She felt the sting of betrayal gnawing at her insides. Just then, her train of thought was interrupted by the familiar sound of shuffling footsteps. Sarah, it was Mr. Thompson, the elderly man she had helped earlier. He approached her with a gentle smile, his face creased with kindness and concern. "I saw you sitting here. Are you all right?" "Not really," Sarah admitted, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "I just lost my job because I tried to help you." His expression shifted from concern to understanding, and he sat down beside her on the bench. "I heard about what happened from a few of the customers. It's a shame. You showed kindness when others wouldn't have, and for that, I admire you." His words wrapped around her like a comforting blanket, providing a momentary reprieve from her distress. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I just don't understand why helping someone is viewed as a problem. It was just a few minutes of my time." He nodded, his eyes reflecting a wisdom born of experience. Sometimes the world doesn't see the value in compassion. People like Mr. Anderson are focused on profit and efficiency, forgetting that businesses thrive on relationships and goodwill. He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I believe that kindness has a way of coming back to us, even when it seems unrewarded." Sarah couldn't help but smile at his perspective. "I hope you're right. It's hard to see a light at the end of the tunnel right now." Mr. Thompson leaned back slightly, considering her words. "You're a good person, Sarah. I've seen you interact with the customers. You bring a warmth to that store that is hard to find these days. It's a shame that Mr. Anderson doesn't recognize that." "I guess he's more interested in the bottom line than in people," she replied, her voice laced with bitterness. "Yes, but I think you have a bright future ahead of you," he said, his tone turning encouraging. "Have you thought about what you want to do next?" "I haven't really had time to think about it," she admitted, the reality of her situation beginning to sink in. "I just feel lost." "Well, why don't we change that?" he suggested, his eyes twinkling with the spark of an idea. "I used to be a businessman in my younger days. I have connections and experience. If you're looking for a job, I'd be happy to help you find one. You shouldn't let one setback define your future." Surprised, Sarah turned to look at him. "Really? You'd do that for me?" "Of course," he replied, his voice warm and sincere. "Let's exchange contact information. I'll do my best to help you get back on your feet." As they shared their details, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Mr. Thompson's kindness was a balm to her wounded spirit. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I really appreciate this. I didn't expect anyone to offer to help me like this. Just call me Walter," he said with a smile. "And remember, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm just a phone call away." They exchanged numbers and sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. "You know," Walter said, breaking the stillness, "life has a funny way of twisting and turning. Sometimes, the things we think are the worst moments can lead us to something truly wonderful." "I hope that's true," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a surge of determination bubbling within her. Perhaps this was not the end but a new beginning. As they stood to leave, Walter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Remember, Sarah, you have a kind heart. Don't let anyone take that away from you." After saying their goodbyes, Sarah walked home, her mind racing with thoughts of the day's events. She couldn't shake the feelings of anger and disappointment towards Mr. Anderson. Why couldn't he see the value in what she had done? The store was more than just a place to work. It was a community hub where people built connections and supported each other. Yet, he had chosen to prioritize profits over people, and it gnawed at her. As she walked, the familiar sights of her neighborhood began to blur. The small houses, the children playing in front yards, and the distant laughter of families enjoying the evening all felt like a world apart from her own turmoil. She found herself replaying the conversation with Walter in her mind. His offer of help was a lifeline, a reminder that there were still good people in the world. But as she turned the corner to her street, her mood darkened again. The sign for the grocery store loomed ahead, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. She felt a wave of resentment wash over her. How could Mr. Anderson not recognize the potential within his employees? How could he be so blind to the community he was running into the ground? A mixture of anger and sadness built up inside her. She had always believed in the power of kindness and the importance of helping others. Yet here she was paying the price for it. The injustice of it all made her fists clench at her sides. Arriving at her doorstep, she paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm the storm within her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but she knew that wouldn't change anything. Instead, she resolved to take control of her situation. She turned back to glance at the store one last time, her heart pounding with determination. "I won't let this define me," she whispered to herself, the words echoing in the stillness of the evening. "I'll find a way to make things right, not just for me, but for everyone who deserves better." With that thought in mind, Sarah stepped inside her home, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She knew that the road ahead might be difficult, but with the support of Walter and her own resilience, she felt a flicker of hope igniting within her. Tomorrow would be a new day, and she was determined to make it count. The next day dawned with a crispness in the air that felt almost electric to Sarah. She had spent the previous night tossing and turning, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. But amidst the turmoil, a flicker of hope had ignited within her at the thought of Mr. Thompson's call. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her reverie. It was him. "Sarah, it's Mr. Thompson. I hope I'm not bothering you." His voice was warm, carrying a gentle enthusiasm. "No, not at all. I was just thinking about you," she replied, her heart racing slightly at the prospect of their meeting. "I'd love to take you for coffee this morning if you're free. I think we can discuss some opportunities that might interest you," he said, and Sarah felt a rush of gratitude. "I'd love that," she replied, trying to keep the excitement from overwhelming her voice. They arranged to meet at a quaint little cafe downtown, a place Sarah had always admired but never dared to visit alone. As she walked towards the cafe, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The streets were alive with the sounds of morning, children chattering, cars rushing by, and the distant laughter of a group of friends. It felt surreal to be stepping into a new chapter of her life, one that seemed both promising and uncertain. When she arrived, Mr. Thompson was already seated at a small table by the window, his kind eyes scanning the menu. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, and she felt instantly at ease. "Good morning, Sarah. I hope you like coffee because I've ordered us both a cappuccino," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Good morning. I love cappuccino," she replied, returning his smile. They exchanged pleasantries as the barista brought their drinks, and once they settled into their conversation, Sarah felt the weight of her worries begin to lift. Mr. Thompson's presence was reassuring, and his stories about his entrepreneurial adventures were both fascinating and inspiring. "I always believed that business is not just about profits," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "It's about the people you serve and the community you build. I saw how you treated me in the store, and it reminded me of my younger days when I was just starting out. You have a gift, Sarah." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot to me, especially right now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just feel so lost after what happened at the grocery store." He nodded, his expression turning serious. "I understand, but I want you to know that sometimes these setbacks can be opportunities in disguise. Tell me about your passions. What do you really want to do?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his question. "I've always loved cooking and baking. My mother taught me how to make the best pies, and I've always dreamed of opening my own bakery." "A bakery sounds wonderful," Mr. Thompson exclaimed, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. There's something so special about food. It brings people together. Why haven't you pursued it? I guess I've always been too afraid to take that leap, she admitted, feeling vulnerable. When I lost my job, it made me realize that I can't let fear hold me back anymore. Exactly. Fear is just a hurdle, Sarah. You can either let it stop you or let it fuel your determination. What if we brainstorm some ideas together? I can help you with the business side of things, he offered, and Sarah felt a rush of hope. Really? You'd do that for me? She asked, her heart swelling with gratitude. Of course. I've had my fair share of struggles, and I want to see you succeed. Life has a funny way of working out, and I believe this is your moment, he said, leaning forward, his tone earnest. As they chatted, Sarah felt the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. She shared her dreams of creating a cozy little bakery, filled with the scent of fresh bread and pastries, a place where people could gather and share their stories. Mr. Thompson listened intently, nodding and asking questions, genuinely interested in her vision. I can see it now, he said, a smile breaking across his face. The warm lights, the laughter of customers, the smell of cinnamon rolls wafting through the air. You have a gift for storytelling, Sarah, and that's what makes a business thrive. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and time slipped away unnoticed. As they wrapped up, he suggested they meet again to discuss more concrete plans. Let's reconvene next week. I'll prepare some resources for you, and we can outline a business plan, he said, his excitement palpable. Sarah couldn't help but smile. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I can't express how much this means to me. I didn't expect to walk away from today feeling so inspired. As they left the cafe, Sarah felt lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. The world seemed brighter, and she was ready to face whatever came next. She waved goodbye to Mr. Thompson, her heart swelling with newfound determination. But as she turned to head home, a familiar sight caught her eye. The grocery store stood across the street, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. A large help wanted sign hung in the window, and a wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Part of her was drawn to the idea of returning, of reclaiming her old life. Yet another part felt a flicker of resentment towards Mr. Anderson, the man who had dismissed her kindness without a second thought. She had been fired for helping someone in need, and the thought of returning felt like a betrayal to her newfound resolve. As she stood there, contemplating her next move, a voice broke through her thoughts. Sarah. She turned to see Mrs. Jenkins approaching with a bright smile. I saw you at the cafe. I'm glad to see you're doing well. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, Sarah replied, forcing a smile. I'm actually exploring new opportunities. Mrs. Jenkins's eyes lit up. That's wonderful. You've always had such a kind spirit. Have you thought about the bakery idea you mentioned? I have actually, Sarah said, her heart swelling with pride. I met with someone who wants to help me get started. Oh, Sarah, that's fantastic. You deserve all the happiness in the world, Mrs. Jenkins exclaimed, her enthusiasm infectious. But then, as they stood in front of the grocery store, Sarah felt a pang of uncertainty. I just don't know if I can leave everything behind. It's hard to let go of what was familiar. Sometimes, dear, stepping out of your comfort zone is the best thing you can do for yourself, Mrs. Jenkins advised, her tone gentle yet firm. You have a gift, and the world needs to see it. As Sarah watched her walk away, she felt a swell of determination. She had already started down a new path with Mr. Thompson's help, and now was not the time to look back. The help wanted sign loomed behind her, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. As she turned to head home, Sarah knew that the journey ahead would require courage and resilience, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace it. She had a vision, a support system, and a fire burning within her that refused to be extinguished. The bakery dream was alive, and with each step she took, she felt more and more like the architect of her own future. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the small town, Sarah found herself standing outside a quaint cafe just a few blocks from her former workplace. The help wanted sign in the cafe window had beckoned her like a siren's call, promising a fresh start. Despite the tremors of uncertainty that coursed through her, she squared her shoulders and pushed the door open, the familiar chime of a bell announcing her arrival. Inside, the cafe was bustling with patrons. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sweet scent of pastries, creating an inviting atmosphere. Sarah approached the counter, her heart racing as she met the gaze of a young woman behind the register. The woman looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Hi there. What can I do for you?" she greeted, her voice friendly but her eyes wary. "Hi, I'm Sarah. I saw the help wanted sign and wanted to apply for the position," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. The woman raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting slightly. "You're aware this is a busy cafe, right? We need people who can handle the pressure." Sarah felt a pang of disappointment but pressed on. "I understand, and I'm more than willing to learn. I worked at the grocery store for a couple of years, and I'm a quick learner." The woman's skepticism deepened. "Yeah, I heard about that store. Things didn't end well for you, did they?" "Not exactly," Sarah admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. "But I want to move forward. I can assure you I'm committed and hardworking." The woman paused, glancing back at the cafe's owner, who was engaged in conversation with a couple of regulars. "Let me talk to the owner, but I can't make any promises," she said, her tone softening slightly. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a seat at one of the small tables, her thoughts spiraling into a mix of hope and apprehension. What if they didn't hire her? What if she never found another job? The weight of her recent termination felt like a heavy anchor holding her back, and she fought against the tide of discouragement that threatened to pull her under. Meanwhile, across town, Mr. Anderson was sitting in his office, a sleek space filled with the latest technology and an air of arrogance. He was in the middle of a meeting with a potential investor, Mr. Green, who had been eyeing the grocery store for expansion. "Now, Mr. Anderson," Mr. Green began, his voice smooth like silk, "I see great potential in your store. With the right investments, we could double the revenue in no time." Mr. Anderson leaned back in his chair, a smug smile on his face. "Absolutely. We've been considering renovations, maybe even a new layout to attract more customers. But it's all about the right timing and the right partners." "And you believe I'm the right partner?" Mr. Green asked, his brows raised in interest. "Without a doubt," Mr. Anderson replied, his confidence unwavering. "I have a vision for this store, but I need someone with your resources to help bring it to fruition. Together, we can turn this place into a powerhouse." Unbeknownst to Mr. Anderson, the man he dismissed earlier, Mr. Thompson, was not just an elderly customer. He was the owner of the building that housed the grocery store, and he had been quietly observing the meeting from a distance. His heart sank at the thought of Mr. Anderson's plans, which he knew were driven by self-interest rather than the well-being of the community. As he stepped outside, he spotted Sarah through the cafe's window, sitting alone and looking pensive. The corners of his lips turned up in a small smile. He had been meaning to talk to her again, to reinforce her courage as she navigated this difficult time. Perhaps this was the moment to offer her support once more. Just as Sarah was lost in her thoughts, she overheard a conversation between two employees at the cafe. Their voices, slightly muffled by the buzz of the crowd, caught her attention. "Did you hear about the stuff going on at Anderson's store?" one of them said, leaning closer to the other as if sharing a secret. "It's like a ticking time bomb. I heard he's been cutting corners to save money." "Yeah, and I heard he's been making some shady deals with suppliers too," the other responded, her eyes wide with intrigue. "If the health department finds out, he could be in serious trouble." Sarah's ears perked up, her curiosity piqued. She leaned in slightly, straining to catch more of their conversation. "What do you mean, shady deals?" she whispered to herself, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Apparently, he's been ordering lower quality products but selling them at the same price." "That's just wrong," the first employee replied, shaking her head. "And the way he fired that girl, Sarah? Totally uncalled for." The mention of her name sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It was as if the universe was drawing a thread between her past and what lay ahead. She felt a sense of indignation bubbling within her, a mixture of anger and determination. If Mr. Anderson was indeed cutting corners, it was up to her to uncover the truth. As they continued their conversation, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. She could gather information, speak to other employees, and piece together a puzzle that could expose Mr. Anderson's unethical practices. The thought ignited a spark of resilience within her, a reminder that she had a voice and that her experience mattered. After the employees finished their chat, Sarah stood up, her heart pounding with newfound purpose. She stepped outside the cafe, the cool evening air brushing against her cheeks, a refreshing contrast to the heat of her determination. She needed to talk to Mr. Thompson. Making her way down the street, she replayed the snippets of conversation in her mind, considering how she could approach Mr. Thompson without sounding desperate or paranoid. She had to be smart about this. When she reached Mr. Thompson's modest home, she knocked on the door, her heart racing. Moments later, he opened it, his expression turning from surprise to warmth. "Sarah, what a lovely surprise," he said, ushering her inside. "I was just about to brew some tea. Would you like some?" "Yes, please," she replied, stepping inside and inhaling the comforting aroma of old books and polished wood. "Mr. Thompson, I heard some things today that I think you should know about Mr. Anderson." He raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Oh, what did you hear?" As she settled into a chair, Sarah recounted the conversation she had overheard at the cafe, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Mr. Thompson listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "This is serious," he said once she finished. "If what you heard is true, then we need to take action. But it's important to gather evidence first. We can't just make accusations without proof." Sarah felt a rush of excitement. "I can talk to more employees. I can find out if anyone else has seen anything unusual." Mr. Thompson smiled, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "That's the spirit, Sarah. Together, we can uncover the truth and put a stop to his unethical practices. You have the heart of a fighter." As they strategized, Sarah felt a sense of purpose blooming within her. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a catalyst for change. The moral dilemma that had once consumed her transformed into a mission, fueled by the kindness she had shown Mr. Thompson and the newfound understanding of her own worth. With each passing moment, the weight of her previous experiences lifted, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. Whatever came next, Sarah was ready to face it head-on, armed with the knowledge that compassion could ignite a revolution, even in the quiet corners of a small town. Sarah sat on the worn-out couch in her small apartment, the afternoon sun filtering through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. She had just finished a call with Mr. Thompson, and the details of their conversation buzzed in her mind like the last lingering notes of a song. They had discussed the possibility of teaming up to expose Mr. Anderson's unethical business practices, and Sarah felt a surge of determination coursing through her veins. With Mr. Thompson's extensive knowledge of business law, she believed they could gather enough evidence to put an end to Mr. Anderson's reign of tyranny over the grocery store and its employees. "Okay, Sarah, focus," she murmured to herself, her fingers tapping nervously against her knee. She grabbed her notebook and began jotting down ideas, her handwriting hurried and messy. She needed a plan. They would start by documenting everything they knew about Mr. Anderson's behavior, the way he mistreated employees, the shady financial dealings that had been whispered about in the break room, and the rumors of his reluctance to provide raises or benefits. Just as she settled into the rhythm of writing, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Mr. Thompson. "Hey, Sarah." His voice came through, steady and reassuring. "I was thinking we could meet at the library tomorrow morning. They have a quiet study room we can use to go over everything." "That sounds perfect," she replied, feeling a rush of gratitude. "Thank you for doing this with me. I really appreciate your help. Of course, you showed kindness when you didn't have to. It's time someone shows you the same," Mr. Thompson replied, his tone warm. After hanging up, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She spent the rest of the evening gathering notes, piecing together the stories she had heard from her former coworkers. Each account painted a picture of a toxic work environment, and she knew that if they could document enough evidence, they might just have a case against Mr. Anderson. The next day arrived with a brisk chill in the air. Sarah pulled on a cozy sweater and headed to the library, her heart racing with anticipation. She found Mr.